Okay, good morning, everybody. Nice to see you here on this Tuesday morning. I want to let you know that next week is going to be our last lecture of the semester. Finals will be the week after that. I believe they start on the 5th and go to the final grades have to be in, I think, on the 14th. So there's not going to be any reopening if you miss it. All right. Again, everything's going to be a straight average. So if you look at your grades and drop the lowest grade and then average those together and then average in the final exam, that'll be your grade for the semester. Hope to see a few of you next semester. I teach World History 2. I have two sections of that, and I have one section of the history of oil. That's for people that are in the P-Tech program. All right, so let's get started. I got everybody who's here. Unfortunately, it's not even 1/4 of the class, but that's beside the point. The lectures will be up there. I give everybody a chance to satisfactorily complete the course. So we're going to talk about Chapter 27. Last time we talked about the Vietnam War and the Great Society. That is up. The link is in one of your announcements. If you want to study for the test, you can read the chapter. And because it is going to be a rather lengthy test, I think we have 2 or 3 chapters that are on it. So it's going to be roughly about 40 questions, mix up of multiple choice, matching, and true false. Okay. A lot of the students that I get a lot of questions. Why don't I give a short answer or an essay test? I don't do that online because sometimes it's hard to read. A lot of students haven't taken English composition yet, and they don't know how to organize their thoughts very well. So it's actually beneficial to the student that I don't do it that way. So we're going to talk about reconsidering the national priorities, twin shock, détente and Watergate. How did détente and the Watergate scandal affect U.S. foreign relations and American politics? We're going to talk about that. Watergate was a scandal where it was discovered that the President of the United States knew about the bugging of a let me see if I can fix this. Okay, here I am back again. I had to fix the frame, and for some reason my computer's a little bit slow, or I'm streaming too fast or whatever. It says I have an excellent connection. So, all right. So, in discovering the limits of the U.S. economy, how did the economic changes affect the way Americans felt about the country? Reshuffling politics, which were the most significant political reforms in the 1970s? We're going to talk about that. And diffusing the women's movement. How successful were feminists in their struggle for gender equality? Now, back then, there was only 2, male and female. And but now, I'm not sure what the number's up to, 37 or something like that. Kind of. Anyway, so from a great society to a conservative one, 1969 and 1988. Of course, we talked about Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, where the government poured a lot of money into programs to help people out of poverty. No, Colby, it's mine. It's the software that I use to stream sometimes does that. I have to put an update in it or something. It keeps stopping on me whenever I do that. And a lot of people are online now, so it's kind of like traffic jam on a 4-lane highway. Basically, is what it is. Watergate, the women's movement, and Jimmy Carter from Georgia. Triangular diplomacy scandal in the White House and the nation after Watergate. Okay, so what we see is Richard Nixon was he was elected president in 1968 because he promised to get us out of Vietnam. And he was a savvy political opportunist. Chinese-Soviet tensions used to the U.S. advantage. He initiated a campaign of illegal actions to weaken his political opponents. He was a dirty politician, basically, is what he was. He played dirty. Of course, which one doesn't, Nixon and Kissinger had common ideas. They used the realpolitik approach, and I'll explain that a little bit later. They were committed to secrecy. And they were very pragmatic, and they collaborated on issues of concern. Regardless of the ideology, China and USSR tensions erupted over a shared border. Russia and China have a shared border. Nixon envisioned triangular diplomacy, where he would be like the mediator between the two, and in turn would be superior of the three. There was a commitment to secrecy. All decisions making concentrated in the White House. He kept Congress, the press, and the State Department in the dark. So any decisions that he made, Congress was never notified. The State Department was never notified, and he kept them secret, which a lot of people didn't like. Also, he used the IRS to go after his political enemies. That sound familiar? In the last administration, they kind of did that, and they got caught. But anyway, so in 1972, China, Nixon visits China. In 1973, the CIA secretly funded a military coup in Chile. Feared a democratic election would lead to nationalizing of U.S. corporations, killed President Allende, and established a brutal military dictatorship under General Pinochet. And the United States was responsible for this, and Nixon was responsible for this. Nixon was as far as foreign policy was concerned, he was very sneaky. And when he actually had to resign from the presidency, only president to do that, and he, in his farewell speech, he said, "I am not a crook." That's what he said, but he was a crook. He visits China. It benefits both cultural and economically. America gains renewed interest in China. The television showed Nixon toasting Mao Zedong while a band playing American patriotic songs. It's no longer viewed as grim and forbidding, which China was often viewed like that, because in 1959 they had their Cultural Revolution, where Mao Zedong was a communist that went through what was called a Cultural Revolution. And what they did was they arrested people who were political opponents and threw them in prison. They weren't called prisons. They were called re-education centers, which a lot of people are talking about for conservatives. I've heard a lot of talk about that. We heard about these FEMA camps over the last 10, 15 years. Well, that's what happens. They throw them into these camps and they re-educate them. Sometimes they don't come out alive. Sometimes they're executed, or sometimes they are starved to death. Cultural exchanges, we exchanged ping pong teams. So we, kind of through sports. And student exchanges, we still do that today. Although, from what I understand, our federal government has limited Chinese exchange students over the last year and a half to 2 years. Some of them they've deported because they suspected they were Chinese spies. In 1972, Nixon met Leonid Brezhnev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, and it was what they called détente, which is a trade pact, and the Soviets, alarmed at warming of U.S. tensions with China, they signed the Strategic Arms Limitation 1 and the ABM Treaty. You can find out what that means in your book. It has to do with nuclear missiles. And this was constant. And I remember as a child, I was born in 1963, which was the tail end of the baby boomers, troops coming home and the nation populating. And my wife is in the last year of the baby boomers. I'm 6 months older than she is. And I remember when I was in school that we had to go through air raid drills, nuclear raid drills, where we had to get under the desk and cover our heads. And I got news for you. That's not going to stop nuclear radiation. Okay. I couldn't understand what was going on. We were constantly threatened with nuclear annihilation. And they came up with a phrase called MAD, M-A-D, mutually assured destruction, which is what would have happened during a nuclear war. They fire a missile, we fire a missile. They fire another one, we fire another one, okay? These nuclear missiles hit cities. They hit major populated cities. They could kill 1 million people on impact. That's how powerful these missiles were. So we were living in fear a lot of the times in the 1970s. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger wove a web of secrecy around the White House, keeping their practice of real politics closely guarded. Now, what is real politics? It's not going through the proper channels to achieve your objectives, like going through Congress and the State Department and everybody else. Everything was so low key and hush-hush in the Nixon administration, and people started to wonder, what's going on? But he did get us out of Vietnam. Peace with honor is basically what he did. The foreign policy proved successful as Nixon was the first American president to visit Red China. Now, red is the color of communism, so that's why they call it Red China. Discuss Nixon's foreign policy, his triangular diplomacy, and describe his successful efforts to drive a wedge between the Soviet Union and Red China. Well, it's very simple. His foreign policy was based upon the decisions that he and Henry Kissinger made. Henry Kissinger was not only his closest advisor, I believe he was Secretary of State. So they would get together, they would formulate a policy, and they would initiate this policy, and they wouldn't tell anybody about it. And reason being, if they failed, nobody would know. If they were successful, okay. But in 1972, Nixon was facing re-election. The triangular diplomacy was to basically, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So he chose China to be friends with, and the Soviet Union started to get nervous, and then he went to the Soviet Union and said, there's nothing to get worried about. Don't worry about this. And, wound up looking like the good guy to one of those. And he did drive a wedge between the Soviet Union and Red China because it was a common border. Now, what happens if both of them go to war? Well, obviously the Soviet Union was larger. Now, China has more people, but do they have military-age young men that are going to fight in a war? Nuclear war, you don't have any ground troops. It's all in the air. It's all missiles and everything. So I think the Soviet Union probably would have beat them, would have annihilated China, but nobody wanted that. Plumbers at the DNC headquarters were caught by Washington police at Watergate, were to plant listening devices, and it was part of Nixon's illegal warfare on opponents. Now, what happened was these alleged burglars, plumbers, go in the middle of the night, and they are planting bugs at the Watergate Hotel, which was the Democratic National Committee's headquarters at the time, in the office buildings that were adjacent to the hotel. And they got caught. And what happened was they were just, they were trying not to turn on the president, but they knew too much. And these guys that were the plumbers, playing these parts of the plumbers, were former CIA operatives. Okay? So they were kind of being sneaky, but they weren't sneaky enough because they got caught. And then there was the cover-up. The president directed the cover-up, and then he lied about it. Attention heats up when Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post start investigating. And then there's the Senate Watergate Committee to investigate the break-in. There were tape recordings that Nixon had in his office, and he was forced to turn them over to the Senate committee. Well, in these recordings, there was 18 minutes missing. And he said, it was just a glitch. But what happened was somebody erased those 18 minutes because that's where they were talking about, some people assume, we can't really know because we don't have them, what really occurred as far as the Watergate thing. So what happens is, I might lose you again here. Hang on a second. Let me see here. All right. No, I didn't lose you again. All right. So what happens is, I want to bring that down. Let me see if I could bring this up a little bit so we can see. No. Let me bring this down. And what happens is the tapes were turned over, and Nixon resigns from the presidency. Now, this was after the election because he didn't resign until 1974, which is 2 years after the election. I used to have the newspaper headline around here somewhere. I saved it since I was 11 because I thought it was going to be important somehow. And Richard Nixon ran against George McGovern, and it was a landslide. He beat McGovern, he had a 520 electoral votes to 17. McGovern was the Democratic candidate because people believed him. He pulled us out of Vietnam, and by 1972-73, there was a peace agreement signed. Nixon resigns in 74, but in 75, the communists actually took over Vietnam. So we got out of there, but it really didn't mean anything because the communists eventually took it over. Effects. Public celebrated democracy's power. It discredited political institution. Congress swings strongly to the Democrats because Nixon was a Republican, so they thought that the Democrats would be a better type of better party to rule. I might lose you again. Hang on one second. Let me see if I can fix this. All right, there we go. All right, I fixed it. Okay. Kissinger as Secretary of State. Might lose you again. Hang on. Okay. All right. So what we see is Kissinger as Secretary of State. President Ford, who was the vice president, comes into the White House. He was a Republican from Michigan. He was actually on the Warren Commission that investigated the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and he was a moron. Because he believed in the single bullet theory, the magic bullet theory. And let me explain that. When President Kennedy was assassinated, his body was brought to Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. And somebody was walking through the hallways after the president had been pronounced dead, and they found this bullet that was pristine. It was about that long, and it fit the Mannlicher Carcano rifle that was allegedly fired by Lee Harvey Oswald, and it was pristine. Nothing happened to it, okay? Well, if you fire a bullet like that, and it hits bone, and it's going to be smashed up pretty good. But what they said was the magic bullet hit Kennedy in the back of the neck, came out, took a right turn in midair, and hit Connally in the back. And then took a left turn and hit Connally in the left wrist. All right? It didn't make any sense. Later on, the Committee on Assassinations in 1977 ruled that President Kennedy was assassinated as a result of a likely conspiracy, not necessarily a proven conspiracy. The goal was to heal the wounds of the past. There was a corrupt administration. Nixon was very corrupt. A couple of people went to jail, including John Dean, who the Democrats brought out this past year to testify on Lord knows what, but he got a pardon, actually. And Nixon made a deal with Ford that if he resigned, Ford would pardon him. And Ford did do that. He pardoned him so that he wouldn't be prosecuted for any crimes. Vietnam was 74 when Ford came into office, was still raging, but the American pullout had reduced the South Vietnamese army to almost nothing, and eventually the North Vietnamese rolled into into Saigon, which was the capital city of South Vietnam, and took over the capital, and American personnel had to hurry up and get out of there. They were getting on choppers and going out to aircraft carriers. They were evacuating very quickly because they knew the communists would probably kill them if they captured them. Kissinger was still the Secretary of State. Nixon's abuse of presidential power and his obstruction of justice in covering up the Watergate burglary led to his resignation from office in 1974. His successor, Gerald Ford, granted Nixon a full and complete pardon for any crimes he may have committed. Now, why would you do that? Why would you do that? Well, because it's based upon political patronage and favors, okay? Probably said, look, I'm going to resign, you're going to be president, but you got to do this one thing. You got to grant me a pardon. Well, sometimes, okay, I'm saying sometimes, when a pardon is granted, it really doesn't matter because in the public's eyes, that person had committed the crime, had been convicted of the crime, but then got pardoned, released. They didn't really go to jail or anything like that. Or they were in jail and they would get pardoned. So Nixon was guilty as sin. Everybody knew it, but Gerald Ford, that was the deal, to give him a pardon. Describe the events surrounding the Watergate scandal leading to the impeachment of Richard Nixon. Well, we know that he had some burglars march in there and in the dead of night, and they were trying to plant listening devices in the Democratic National Headquarters so that they could listen in on their political opponents. and that's what happened, and he got caught. And the only reason he got caught is because the Washington police were on their toes. Whether they were tipped off or not, I don't know. It's probably the only time that the Washington, D.C. police have ever been on their toes, if you read about their history. But anyway, and he basically was impeached, but he wasn't convicted. He resigned before he convicted. See, a lot of people have this misconception that if a public figure or a politician is impeached, that means they go to jail. No. Two houses. The House of Representatives comes up with articles of impeachment. That's the indictment. Then there's a trial in the Senate, and if they're convicted in the Senate, then they get kicked out of office. But that never happened. In fact, there was only two other times that I'm aware of. One of them was Andrew Johnson was almost impeached by one vote. He was almost kicked out of office by one vote, luckily. And then, of course, with President Trump, the Senate voted not to convict. There was no evidence really to convict him, so they voted not to, even though the other side tried. You're going to notice, ladies and gentlemen, no matter what side a person is on, there's always this political theater that occurs, and there's always this disinformation that happens in the press. You have to be smart enough to use critical thinking to understand what is going on and what is the purpose of the other side doing it. Okay, so when we talk about the mainstream media, I think they've lost a lot of credibility within the last 15 years, and so we stopped watching mainstream media because we don't know who to believe a lot of times, and a lot of us are sitting in this period of confusion. And also during this pandemic, there's been a lot of back and forth statistics and things that we should do and we shouldn't do. Dr. Fauci actually got on the news last night and tried to make us feel guilty for celebrating Thanksgiving. Anyway, because of what happened in Vietnam, there were a lot of refugees that came to the United States. I was in junior high school at the time, over on the West Bank, and I was at a place called Edna Carr Junior High School. And at that time, my wife and I went to, wait, let me fix this. This is ridiculous. Put my arms in front of me, they turn gray. Okay, let's see. All right, let's see here. Let's see how that works. Okay. All right. So, there were a lot of Vietnamese refugees. But at the time, I didn't really understand what they went through to get away from Vietnam. This is a communist takeover of a country that was once considered the pearl of the Far East at one time. It was a travel destination. People spoke French there because it was a French colony at one time. But all these people that did not want to live under communist rule were jumping in the oceans. They were trying to get to U.S. Navy ships in harbors around Vietnam so they could come here. And at that early age, I was roughly, I think, about 12 when it happened. And they came here, and I didn't understand them. And to be perfectly honest, there was some animosity toward them because it seems like they were getting special treatment. But later on, I learned about the struggle, and then I said, well, that's why it happened that way, and that's why. But they have assimilated very well into United States culture, and again, bringing their own culture with them. The end of the long boom, there was an oil embargo, and then the environmental movement, and these were certain things that occurred in the U.S. economy. The grim economic news, the standard of living began to decline. The cost of the Vietnam War was staggering for Americans, and we couldn't understand. We spent all that money and we still lost. All right, and then there was the oil embargo, and of course the environmental movement. Questions about endless economic growth. Realize natural resources. We realize that natural resources are limited. Well, now we know they're not. Since we started opening up the drilling in the United States over the last 5 years, we ended a moratorium on drilling. And have you noticed what happened to the gas prices? Okay. So back in the 70s, there was this, we're going to run out of this and we're going to run out of that. And there was this conservation effort going on and its impact on the environment. Let me just say this. When it comes to global warming or climate change, we're hearing a lot of things, again, that are confusing. And my take on this, and I don't give my opinion that much, is that Mother Nature takes care of herself. All right? She recovers. She always finds a way to survive. It's not, are you going to, limit your lifestyle for a half a degree every 100 years? Doesn't make any sense to me. And people that have these electric cars, well, do you know how many diesel engines it takes to power the power station where you charge that car? So it doesn't really make any sense to me. But then again, there are a lot of people that truly believe it. This was a population center of the United States. It was the Rust Belt. Part of the economic downturn in the 1970s included factory closings in the so-called Rust Belt, an area of the country that had previously been the center of U.S. industrial might. Increasing competition from lower wage labor, both overseas and in less unionized Sun Belt to the south and the southwest, encouraged companies to move manufacturing plants out of Great Lakes and the upper Midwest region. And one of these was the Ford plant. When the Ford plant closed down in Detroit, Detroit just went to crap. Okay, and from what I understand, never fully recovered in the 1970s from that. And then we started talking about nuclear power, where nuclear plants would actually spring up, and nuclear power would be used to power, whole neighborhoods and suburbs and things of that nature. Well, here's the problem with that. Something happens and you have a radiation leak, you have to evacuate that whole neighborhood, and people are in danger. And I think there was one accident at 3 Mile Island, and then in Russia later on in the 1980s, there was the Chernobyl accident where a whole city had to be evacuated. And in fact, it's still abandoned to this day. But we start to see a decline in jobs because everything's starting to move overseas. Now, is this a result of Nixon's détente with Russia and his association with China? I tend to agree so, because if you look at it, where Apple phones are made, where are they made? Anybody know? Are y'all awake? I'll wait for the answer because I got to get some water. No? Nobody knows where Apple phones are made. What country? Nobody knows what country. Are y'all listening? Or did you just turn it on and walk away? I'll give you a hint. It's in the East. Oh, you got to be kidding me, Misty. Do you have an iPod? Do you have an iPhone? Oh. How many of you have iPhones? Now, I'm not treating you because I think you're ignorant. I'm curious as to how many of you have an iPhone. China. They're made in China. Okay? Why? Because the labor is a lot cheaper. And in fact, working conditions got so bad at the factory there, they had to put a suicide net around the building because people were killing themselves. The goods are cheaply made in China. If you go to Walmart, a lot of goods are made in China over there. They made American flags for a long time that they sold in Walmart. Anyway, so a lot of these jobs were going overseas. Also, there was a conflict. Racism kind of raised its head again in the 1970s. And as we look at this photograph, there was white resistance to school busing in Boston, sometimes turned violent in the mid-70s. On April 5th, 1976, white high school students from South Boston and Charlestown met with a city councilwoman who supported their boycott of classes because they said they weren't going to attend a school that was not in their district. They were being bused to other districts to make it racially equal. Outside City Hall, they chanced upon lawyer Theodore Landsmark and assaulted him. Economic turmoil underlay such occasional displays of ethnic or racial tension and violence in the 70s. In 1974, the city of Boston implemented a court order ordering to desegregate its public schools. This is 1970. The order to desegregate came down from the federal government in the 1950s. So you got the 1970s, they're desegregating their schools. Southie in the title refers to the neighborhood of South Boston. At one time, Lone Malloy was an English teacher at South Boston High School, and she kept a diary of the events. Her insider account is often noted for its balance and insight. So people were fighting over the issue of being bused to desegregate. They said desegregate, really? Yeah, desegregate its public schools. So you've got where you got a school that and which is racist in and of itself because you want segregation, not desegregation. And what it used to do is it used to bus students from if you were white, they'd bus you to an all-white school. If you were black, they'd bus you to an all-black school. Okay? So they wanted desegregation, which means they wanted white and black schools, which is racist. What was the economic landscape of the United States in 1970? How did rising energy prices affect different parts of the country? How extensive were efforts at gasoline conservation? I remember people used to ride their bikes to work in the 1970s. My father, we lived on the West Bank, and my father was a radio announcer at a radio station, and usually downtown in New Orleans, and he used to take the ferry almost every day. Sometimes he'd take the bridge. Now, back then, there was only one bridge. There was only one, like, 4-lane bridge that went over. It's not the 2 4-lane bridges we have now. It was one 4-lane bridge. And he used to come home in the afternoon. He'd sit for a trip that should only take him 10 minutes. It'd usually take him an hour and 15 minutes. And he was just tired of it. And that's one of the reasons why we moved to Metairie at the time. But then he found out about Metairie traffic. Anyway, Earth Day. We talk about celebrating the Earth. This is a natural gas tank at a Los Angeles refinery is painted to mark Earth Day, an annual event to increase awareness and appreciation of the Earth's ecosystem. It was first celebrated on April 22nd, 1970, and we still celebrate it to this day. We're always talking about energy conservation. We talk about wind. We talk about solar power. I'm sorry, but you can't run a car on wind, and you can't run a car on solar power. There has to be fossil fuels involved. Electricity, but electricity, like I said, you've got diesel engines that charge the electrical station that charges your car. So what's the point? Okay. And I think we've gotten into a lot of just micromanaging the energy field. In 1973, the oil-producing nations of the Middle East boycotted the United States. Now, why did they boycott us? Because we supported Israel in a war over there, and that's why they boycotted us. And the gas prices increased 4 times. After the boycott, there was limited production, and it kept prices high. The largest producers of oil around the Persian Gulf. That was OPEC. It also included Venezuela, too. Venezuela used to have a lot of oil. Now they're broken down because of their socialist government. To protest U.S. support of Israel. The Arab nations, the Arabs and the Jews have been at war for a long time. And to go back a little bit, I'm going to talk about a little bit just about what happened during World War I. In 1917, there was a British ambassador by the name of Arthur Balfour, and he issued the Balfour Declaration, which basically stated that Palestine, which is the area of Israel now, will be given to the Jews. Well, that kind of ticked off all the Muslims over there. And then in 1948, after World War II, actually in 1945, a lot of Jewish refugees who had survived the Holocaust had gone to Israel because they heard that was their homeland. And they started repopulating it. Well, Israel became a state through the United Nations in 1948. And the Muslims have never supported it. But as we see now, there's over 5 peace agreements going on between Israel and some nations over there, which astound me because I never thought it would actually happen. Well, the United States has been a staunch supporter of Israel, despite Netanyahu and Benjamin, who everybody calls Bibi Netanyahu, who has actually been kind of fooled a lot of people. We thought he was straight shooter, but actually he's kind of corrupt, allegedly. And so the Arab nations boycotted the United States. So we didn't get a lot of oil. So the prices went up. I remember that too. My dad going and waiting in line for 2 hours to get 3 gallons of gas. It was kind of rationed, even though we had massive reserves. And the problem there was we were not energy independent. We had not discovered oil in Alaska yet, or Canada. So we were going to build a pipeline to do that. Again, when you have a boycott against oil and you limit production, the price of gasoline goes up. I remember 4.5 years ago, gas was $4.35 a gallon. Now it's what? Between $1.65 and $1.72? Wonder why. Okay. The drilling has become much safer. After the boycott, there was limited production. And what happened was when the Israelis went into Palestine because it was given to them and established Israel, there were a lot of Palestinians who were displaced. And that's when we start to see the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and they start to do things through terrorism. When you are an Israeli citizen, you have to do 30 days mandatory military service every year. Now, a lot of people in the United States have dual citizenship in the United States and in Israel. They go back and they serve their 30 days and then they come home. Well, what if you're in the middle of a war? Well, they keep you in for the duration. 1967 war between Egypt and Syria attacks 6 years later. The U.S. gave Israeli army critical weapons. And, of course, our friend Henry Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize. And there was a warming of U.S. relations with Egypt in the 1970s. Let's see. Steeper energy costs accelerated inflation. Okay, well, if you don't have anything to heat your house, wow, you're going to freeze to death. Or in the summer, especially here in the South where it gets really, really hot and you don't have air conditioning. Oof. So energy costs kind of went up because of the cost of fuel. It's all relative. It's a cause and effect type of relationship. Environmental awareness grows. Membership in organizations grows. The Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, the National Wildlife Federation. It was mostly concerned for conserving the areas for animals. The media examines the environmental problems. Acid rain, contamination of groundwater, smog, rainforest destruction, oil spills, nuclear waste disposal, species extinction, ozone depletion, and global warming. Now, ozone depletion was the climate change thing when I was in the 70s and the 80s. And the ozone layer around the Earth protects it from harmful rays from the sun. And allegedly using aerosols like aerosol deodorant, caused the ozone to deplete. But then we start to see these people that get on the bandwagon for global warming. In the last, I believe, 200 years, the temperature on this planet has only gone down 2 degrees. So, and we heard that the polar ice caps were going to be melting. Well, guess what? They multiplied. They're bigger now. So, and this is all according to fact and science, all right? Anyway, so the impact on public health, about environment. A lot of people were having more incidences of skin cancer. Why? Because they were in the sun more. It's not because the sun was more potent. They were in the sun more. Unlimited consumption was irresponsible. They urged government action. The EPA was to require fuel-efficient cars. This is when we start seeing the Pintos and the Chevettes and things of that nature. Promote renewable energy sources, water, solar, and wind power, and protested construction of new nuclear power plants. There was no way to dispose of the waste from a nuclear power plant. The impact on public health, chemical impacts. Pesticides work their way up the food chain, okay? And that's a concern because they get in the food. Also, some artificial sweeteners are carcinogenic, which means they cause cancer. And some of these, like pesticides, like Roundup. Roundup was just hit with a class action suit because they found out that Roundup's chemicals cause cancer. And a lot of people were getting it because of that. Let's see. Oh, yeah, lead in paint and gas causes brain damage. Of course, if you're going to sit there and smell the pump for about an hour, yeah, it's going to cause brain damage. I don't know anybody that does that. If you do, please write in. No, I'm just kidding. And so you have, lead in paint. Kids were eating lead paint. Little children were going up because lead paint was used predominantly for office buildings. The Love Canal of New York, there was a dumping of toxic chemicals. It was buried in a dry canal covered with dirt. It gave land to the city, which built a school on the location. There was mysterious smells and oozing fires. Cancer rates soared. In Louisiana, we have a place called Cancer Alley. It's between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, where all the refineries are located. And it was discovered that there was a higher instance of leukemia in younger children because of it. Okay, finally, the government buys out the neighborhood and moves the residents. The beneficial activities for health are exercising, such as running. Entries in marathons grow, outdoor recreation, hiking, camping, bicycling. Now, people younger age, they sit inside and play games all day, video games. When I was a kid, we didn't have that. We went outside, we tried to get up a football game or a game of kick the can or something like that. It was a lot of fun. Anyway, congressional power was reasserted. Jimmy Carter, who was a Democrat governor from Georgia, decided that he was going to run for president in 1976. He said, "I will never lie to you." And he was a peacemaker. He got a couple of peace deals signed, but they didn't last. Authority and traditional values were spurned. Use of illegal drugs and casual sex relationships grow in the 1970s. Basically, with the advent in the 60s of the birth control pill. But that doesn't stop venereal diseases and all types of other infections like hepatitis. Films highlighted misconduct in government and during the war. There were changes in government. Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976, and Congress asserts more authority. Now, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Okay. Congress asserts more authority. Let's see here. Okay. Congress was weakened. They struck back to regain power with the War Powers Act of 1973. Covert actions, which means black ops, were investigated more thoroughly. And it was a call for transparency in government. Where have you heard that before? And the government claimed secrecy necessary because of the Cold War. Now, the War Powers Act was in response to limiting the president to wage undeclared wars, because Congress has to declare war before the country is supposed to go to war. But sometimes you have an executive action, and then we have to declare war. He gets a certain amount of time, and then you have to declare war. Congress never declared war formally in Korean War or Vietnam War, and it's required by the Constitution. The covert actions, these black ops, had to be investigated. Operation Chaos by the CIA was an illegal domestic espionage against anti-war dissidents. CIA involvement in assassination attempts against leftist foreign leaders, Castro of Cuba and Lumumba of the Congo. The transparency call, government claims secrecy necessary because of the Cold War. The War Powers Act of 1973 actually required the U.S. president to get congressional approval within 90 days of sending troops into a conflict abroad. Sometimes the troops have to be sent quickly, and you can't wait for Congress to meet. You have to make that decision. Well, this lets the president make the decision to send the troops, and then a decision is made whether to keep them there. Congress reasserted its power in the wake of the revelation of CIA covert operations, limiting the CIA and the federal government's power. Covert operations that were uncovered by the Church Committee. Well, like I said, there was an assassination attempt on Castro and Lumumba in Nigeria. And what was Congress going to do? See, CIA has a separate budget. There's a covert budget. And then there's money that they use for operations that are off the books that nobody knows about. You see? So when you hear something about the government doesn't kill its own people, well, you don't know the CIA that well. Jimmy Carter, he was a 1976. He runs for president. He's professional, personal. He was an Annapolis graduate. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy, served during World War II. I don't think he saw any combat. He was a social moderate. He was an engineer. He supported civil rights while governor. He was a born-again Christian, social liberal and fiscal conservative. First president from the Deep South in more than a century. And social moderate and economic conservative, wanted to balance the federal budget. He was closer to Republicans than he was to his own party, believe it or not. Moralistic stands do not mesh with compromises needed to work with Congress. He tried to govern as an outsider, and he was seen as inexperienced and naive. A lot of times it takes an outsider to get in there who hasn't been part of that Washington mess for a long time in order to get things done. And Carter was one of these people, but he wasn't really that successful. What are the dangers of the United States using assassination as a tool of U.S. foreign policy? Is the use of assassination compatible with the practice of democracy, and how might it affect American society at home, as well as the way other nations perceive the United States? Well, there's a couple of answers to this question. If the United States pursues assassinations in their foreign policy, then they run the risk of retaliation through the same form. For instance, if we assassinate a world leader, they come over here and try to assassinate our world leader. And that affects the American society perception of how government should run. Also, if the United States pursues a policy of assassination and they get away with it, they'll be feared. Oh, they'll be feared, but nobody at home will trust them. That's how other nations would perceive them. How might the Al-Qaeda attacks of September 11, 2001, and the assassination of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan by U.S. Navy SEALs in 2011 have changed the way Americans view the use of targeted assassinations as a tool of U.S. foreign policy? Well, let's look at this in one perspective. Al-Qaeda is not another country. Al-Qaeda was a terrorist organization. Osama bin Laden was the head of that terrorist organization who murdered 3,000 people. My take on it is karma catching up with him. All right. And of course, Baghdadi was assassinated by President Trump this past year. Notice there hadn't been a lot of terrorist attacks, right? You take out the head of the snake, that's what happens. Should the attacks have altered Americans' attitudes about this issue? Well, it depends, because there was a lot of people that believed that the 9/11 attacks were a conspiracy by our own government to get us into a war in the Middle East. And there are some facts to justify that, but as a whole, I think we realized as a people that no matter what color we are, no matter what religion we are, when our homeland is attacked, we all stick together. So I think that's what the attitude adjusted. That's how it affected the attitudes of Americans. This is Fidel Castro, and when the plot came out to assassinate him, it was broadcast in all the papers. Some say, that the CIA tried several times to assassinate Castro, but it didn't work. That's why they went after Kennedy. There's so many conspiracy theories out there. Now, in 1976, Jimmy Carter barely beat Gerald Ford in the election, 50 to 47.9, 297 electoral votes, and he was elected to the White House in 1976. Gerald Ford would not seek any type of political office after that. After he was president, he kind of went back to Michigan and lived his life. He was also a klutz. He used to fall down all the time. Foreign policy based on idealism under Jimmy Carter, promotion of human rights, defense of all dissidents, pro or anti-U.S., shift from east-west to northern-southern, and the Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords was a peace agreement that he got between Egypt and Israel at that time. Jimmy Carter refashioned U.S. foreign policy by returning control of the Panama Canal to Panama, reining in the CIA, and brokering a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. His rise to the presidency, his successes and failures, one of the things that was really big was the economy. High unemployment, high interest rates. I think interest rates went up to like 24, 25% under his administration because he couldn't control it. The war on waste, there was an energy crisis Carter pressed Americans to conserve. The Department of Energy was established. And then we built the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act in 1980 was the single largest addition to the nation's system. And then we started using nuclear energy. Now, this is a photo of Canada. It was an untouched wilderness. One day I'm going to get there and take a look around. It's from what I understand, it's beautiful, especially when you go on a cruise, but they have earthquakes up there. They had a bad one in 1964. This is the Silent Spring map. We're building nuclear plants between 1969 and 1980. All of the nation's 104 commercial nuclear power reactors either came online or were in the process of being planned or built. The United States has roughly 1/4 of the 435 commercial nuclear power reactors in the world. Despite nuclear energy's important role in U.S. electricity production, there is still no system in place for the permanent disposal of radioactive waste. So where are we putting it? Are we burying it underground? If we bury it underground, does it have an effect on the soil? If we're dumping it in the ocean, does it have an effect? Is it going to cause mutations in wildlife? Who knows? A lot of people have fantasized, probably make a very good horror movie. Diffusing the women's movement, pressing for equality. There were new opportunities for women in education, the workplace, and family life. There was a push for equality under the law, and there was a backlash. Spread of feminism raised the question, is gender fundamentally identification, dividing line between humans? It might be. Reconsideration of the gender roles. New title for a Miss was a Ms., and not all groups agreed on all issues. The common concerns were equal pay for equal work, abortion rights, equal work at home, and violence that women face through domestic violence. In education, it is expected to develop a career after college, Rising graduate and professional schools. Single-sex private schools go coeducational. Blurring of lines between gender-specific work and family life. Traditional family life disappears and divorce rates climb because women discover, hey, they can make it on their own. I was in high school in the 1980s, and in my senior year, 1981, our school went co-ed. We were an all-boys public school in Jefferson Parish, which was really weird because I came from Orleans Parish, and we didn't have that there. But there were females at our high school, and I must say it was a shock at first, but eventually we got used to it, and it's still a co-ed school to this day. Title IX is a part of the Educational Amendments of 1972, equal spending on sports programs. The Equal Rights Amendment came out in 1972. It was sent to states, and it wasn't approved, by the way. Roe v. Wade was a women's choice among constitutional privacy rights concerning abortion. There was a backlash. The media highlighted the negative. They attempted to sidestep serious issue of rights. There was this idea of masculinity, how women's equality impacted men's roles and altered dynamics of power in relationships. Opponents' victories were the Hyde Amendment in 1976. You can read about that in your book. And there was a Stop the ERA campaign. In 1976, there was also a mini-series that premiered called Roots. And it captured the largest television audience ever at that time. It was about Haley's ancestors. It offered tens of millions of Americans an intimate and sympathetic understanding of the horrific story of black slavery and survival. Roots also represented the post-1960s emphasis on preserving and respecting group histories and identities rather than emphasizing only individual success and assimilation into the mainstream. Later on, it was determined that the book was a complete fallacy. Alex Haley wrote it. Now, this is what historians say. I mean, I've never read the book, so a lot of historians have claimed that. Discussed the women's movement and the consciousness efforts, raising efforts in the 1970s. Well, you can see that in the divorce rate because a lot of women were determining, hey, I don't have to put up with this anymore. I can go out and make a living on my own. We have equality now. The successes and the backlash that followed. You still had a nation in the 1970s that still relied on traditional values of the woman stays home, takes care of the kids, and cooks, and the man goes out and makes the living. So now you have women entering the workforce, probably don't make as much money as men, but they still make enough money to go out on their own and support children if they have to, if they get a college degree, or whatnot. So the backlash was that, basically men took a hit to their egos is what happened. And it kind of defined for about the next 50 years how politics was going to be administered, well, not administered, but how people were going to focus on politics. Women's rights were first and foremost a lot of the issues of politicians. You'll notice in this last presidential election, there was also elections for the House of Representatives. A lot of women, a lot of minority women and veteran women were elected to seats in the House of Representatives. It's phenomenal. If a woman can do the job, put her in there. Okay? But anyway, so, okay, we're done for today. And what I want to do is I want to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. And please convey those wishes to your families. I know it's going to be a little difficult. This year was very trying for a lot of people. Lord knows I honed my audio and video editing skills. And if you don't have anything to do over the holidays, why don't you check out, I'm going to do a plug now. Why don't you check out my true crime channel on YouTube. I do mini documentaries where I narrate them and show pictures and stuff. We have presently about over 3,500 subscribers on that one channel. I conceive them, I write them, I narrate them, I edit them, and I produce them. And it's called True Crime man's dark imagination. Everybody's got that dark part of their brain where they like unsolved crimes and murders and things of that nature. So the station's doing all right. I can't retire yet, but hopefully that'll come. But we've gotten the last 2,500 subscribers within the last 5 months. And that's a big deal for me, because a lot of true crime channels are just girls putting on makeup telling a story. And mine is a little bit more in-depth because of my training as an historian. So if you get bored over the holidays, it's called True Crime, Man's Dark Imagination, and you'll see it up there. And I have about 70 episodes up there. So if you want to binge on them, some of the early ones aren't as good as some of the later ones, but they do get better. But I will see you guys next Tuesday for our last lecture. Thank you, Misty, very much. I appreciate it. It's just my wife and my daughter and I. In fact, tonight we're going to buy a turkey. It's probably going to be about 12 pounds or 15 pounds. We don't want anything really big. Normally we are invited over to a friend's house, but because of this most recent unpleasantness, we have had to curtail our plans, as have many people done. Ladies and gentlemen, all it takes is one person saying no. That's it. And if one person says no, then a whole bunch of people join in and say no. I'm not downplaying this virus. I do know it exists, but I just think it's a lot of things around it have been hyped up. And if they've been hyped up and it's as serious as it is, that's why I remained online teaching away from Nunez. Now, from what I understand, we got a second wave on the way. I'm not so sure. We'll see. But maybe I'll see you guys again. And so next Tuesday at 10 o'clock, we'll have our last lecture. I want you to enjoy your holidays. And don't forget to read chapters 26 and 27. They will be on the final. And I will come on with an announcement for the final after the lecture next week. So everybody be good.